The order came through on a Tuesday. Not a declaration, not a broadcast, just a file transfer, 17 characters, a grid coordinate, and a classification stamp that translated roughly to low priority, no resistance expected. Admiral Drevon Solis reviewed it for 40 seconds before approving it. He had approved 612 similar orders in his career. He remembered none of them. He stood at the wide observation window of the flagship Undying Reach as the fleet dropped through the upper atmosphere of the third planet in a system with no name in Varath charts, only a number, Sol 3. The humans called it Earth. Drevon did not think about what the humans called it. He was thinking about dinner. 17 warships peeled into formation and began their first pass. The bombardment was precise, almost gentle by Varath standards. They targeted infrastructure first: power grids, transport hubs, communication towers. The idea was to remove the skeleton before worrying about the flesh. Drevon watched the thermal bloom of a coastal city disappear in 14 seconds and made a small note in the operational log. Shields unnecessary, return fire negligible, proceeding to Phase 2. He closed the log and went to eat. Somewhere below, in a building that still had power because it sat on a hill outside a city that had not yet been touched, Director Haruto Endo received a tablet from a junior aide who could not look him in the eye. The footage on it was already 40 minutes old. Endo watched a city he had visited twice vanish in a column of light. He watched a second city start to burn. He set the tablet face down on the conference table and looked at the 11 people sitting around it. They were all staring at him. Most governments on Earth had suspended their normal operations the moment the ships appeared. The emergency channel had opened in 40 languages inside 6 minutes. What it had not produced was a plan, because no plan had ever been made for this. Nobody had written the manual. Nobody had believed the manual would ever be needed. Endo said, "How long before they hit population centers that haven't been warned?" His aide said, "We don't know." Endo said, "Then find out. And while you're finding out, I need every head of state on a secure line in the next 90 minutes. I don't care what time it is where they are." The aide left. The others around the table began talking at once. Endo did not join them. He was looking out the window at a sky that was still blue, still ordinary, except for the faint silver streak near the horizon that was not a cloud and not a plane. He thought about something his father had told him once, after a bad flood had taken their neighborhood. His father had stood in the mud looking at everything they'd lost and said, "You don't rebuild because you're not scared. You rebuild because you are, and you do it anyway." Endo pulled the tablet back up and turned it face forward. The Emergency Response Coalition was formed in 72 hours. It was the fastest political agreement in recorded human history, which said something both about how frightened everyone was and about how quickly fear, when it reaches a certain temperature, stops being paralysis and becomes fuel. Drevon received the report on human government activity and found it mildly curious. He had expected collapse. What his intelligence officers were showing him instead was consolidation, a merging of command structures across dozens of previously competing states. He flagged it as an anomaly and filed it. He did not consider it a threat. No species in the process of being pacified had ever successfully reorganized. On the ground, in every city that still had power and people, something was starting. It did not look like resistance yet. It looked like people clearing rubble, moving injured to shelters, counting who was left, and asking the same question in 100 different languages. What do we have, and what can we do with it? It was not defiance. Not yet. It was something quieter and in the long run more dangerous. Endo spent his first night in the Coalition's temporary headquarters, a converted rail station in the Swiss Alps, reviewing casualty projections. The numbers were not numbers. They were cities he knew, airports he had flown through, markets he had walked in. He let himself look at them for an hour. He did not let himself look away, and he did not let himself stop thinking clearly. At 2 in the morning, his aide found him still at the table, working through a list of names: engineers, physicists, weapons researchers, anyone with a clearance and a skill the Coalition might need. His aide asked if he had slept. Endo said no, and that he would not for the foreseeable future, and that this was fine, and asked if the secure line to the Nairobi Emergency Center was set up yet. It was. He picked up the phone. On the undying reach, Drevon slept well. His second officer, Commander Lyra Vaz, remained on the bridge through the night, watching the data feeds from the surface. The bombardment was proceeding on schedule. Casualties on the human side were significant. Everything was within expected parameters. She almost closed the feed. Then one small report caught her eye. Not a weapon fired, not a soldier moving. A data packet, a burst transmission between two surviving human networks, routed through what looked like a repurposed weather satellite. The transmission was encrypted, in a format her decryption suite didn't recognize. That meant the humans had created new encryption in the last 72 hours. Lyra Vaz looked at that fact for a long time. Then she wrote one line in her personal log, not the official record, her own, and went back to watching the feeds. The line read, "They are not panicking. Watch this one carefully. Sergeant Belanovic had not slept in 2 days, and she did not care. Sleep was a problem for later. Right now she was kneeling in the rubble of what had been a tram depot in the southern end of a city that no longer had a name worth using, pressing her back against a scorched concrete wall and listening. The sound the Vareth ground units made when they moved was like wet metal dragged across stone, a low, rhythmic grinding that carried farther than it should. She had learned that in the first 6 hours of their arrival. She had learned a lot of things in the first 6 hours. She held up a fist. The 4 soldiers behind her went still. The grinding sound slowed, then stopped. She waited, counted. 1 breath, 2, 3, and then the Vareth scout stepped around the corner of the tram depot and she was already moving. 2 of her soldiers came from the other side. The scout was on the ground before it could raise its weapon, still alive. That was the point. That was why they had practiced the takedown 14 times that morning using a crate as a stand-in. They needed it alive. Her unit had found 2 downed Vareth drones in the first week, 1 shot by a lucky missile from a military base that no longer existed, 1 that had simply crashed, maybe a system's fault, maybe something else. They had taken those drones apart with their hands when they ran out of the right tools, and they had learned things. The power cores could be repurposed. The casing was brittle at the seams if you hit it at the right angle. The navigation circuits were alien, but the logic was not so different. And Bella had a soldier in her unit, named Istvan, who had been an electrical engineer before the world changed. And Istvan had spent 3 nights with the drone circuits, and emerged looking like he had not eaten, and also like he had solved something important. The Vareth armor had a cycling weakness. Every 11 seconds the plates vented heat from the joints. If you timed your shot to land exactly when the vent opened, you could punch through. It was a narrow window. It required patience. Humans, it turned out, could be very patient when they were very angry. The captured scout provided more. Not through conversation, the scout did not speak, or perhaps chose not to. But its equipment did. Istvan and 2 others spent 40 hours on the suit systems alone and came out with a partial frequency map for Vareth short-range communications. It was not complete. It was enough. Bella sent the intelligence up the chain to the Coalition with a single note attached: share everything. All cells, now. Within 4 days, 30 resistance units across 3 continents were timing their shots to the 11-second window. Commander Lyra Vaz filed her report to Admiral Drevon Solis at the end of the 3rd week. Ground losses were above projected levels. 3 heavy assault units had been pinned and destroyed by human forces using ambush tactics that had not appeared in any pre-campaign intelligence. 2 supply lines had been severed. 1 drone relay had been captured, which was the part that made Lyra pause before she wrote it down, because captured equipment meant study, and study meant adaptation. An adaptation in 3 weeks was a pace she had never seen. Drevon listened to the report while reviewing other files. He increased the bombardment frequency. He ordered heavier ground units to the surface. He said, "They are afraid and acting out. It will pass." Lyra said, "Sir, the captured drone." Drevon said, "Noted." She knew what noted meant. It meant he had heard her and filed it somewhere that would not be opened again. She had served under him for 9 years and she respected him truly. But there were moments when she saw the shape of the thing that would eventually break him, and it looked exactly like this, like certainty wearing the face of experience. She wrote in her log that night, "They adapted in 3 weeks. No species does this. Not in 3 weeks. In the Korath campaign, it took 11 years for the Resistance to reach basic weapons modification. In the Selûne conflict, 8 years for the first counterstrike on Varath communication lines. Earth, 3 weeks. Either our pre-campaign intelligence was catastrophically wrong about their baseline, or there is something about the way they process loss that is fundamentally different from every other species we have encountered." She did not send the log entry to Drevon. She kept it private. She was not sure why, except that writing it for herself felt more honest than writing it for the record. On the ground, Bella's unit moved to a new position before dawn. They never stayed anywhere more than 48 hours. This was a rule she had made on day 2, after watching another unit get hit by a precision strike 12 hours after establishing a fixed camp. The Varath had good sensors. Moving was the answer to good sensors. She had lost 4 people in 3 weeks. She knew all their names. She knew where 2 of them were from and what they had done before the war. She had learned years ago, in a different kind of loss, that grief did not wait for the right moment, and neither did the work, and you had to choose one to do first. She chose the work. But she remembered the names, every single one. That was the part she never said out loud. You kept the names because they were the reason. You kept moving because that was how you honored them. Stopping was not mourning. Stopping was just stopping. The Varath campaign was no longer boring. It had become something Drevon's people had a word for but had not used in a very long time. Contested. 6 months in, the surface of the Earth looked like something that had given up. From orbit, the thermal imaging showed vast stretches of dark cities that no longer held power, coastlines reshaped by impact, road networks reduced to disconnected fragments. The Varath campaign reports described it as an 87% infrastructure suppression and marked it as within acceptable parameters for final pacification. What the orbital scans did not show was what was happening underground. Dami Adami had been a structural aerospace engineer in Lagos before the first ships appeared. She had been working on atmospheric re-entry shielding for a commercial satellite launch program. That work had become, very quickly, the most relevant thing she had ever done in her life. She was brought into the continuity engine program on day 41, driven through the night to a facility that had been, until recently, a hydroelectric dam. They took her down 2 levels below the waterline, handed her a hard drive containing everything the Coalition had captured from Varath drones and the one live scout, and pointed her at a desk. There were 17 other people in the room, from 9 countries, none of whom she had met before. They did not spend much time introducing themselves. They had the same work. That was enough. She spent the first 10 days studying the Varath deflector field architecture. It was elegant, far more advanced than anything in human theory. It worked by projecting a continuous resonance envelope around the ship, a standing energy field that dispersed incoming kinetic and thermal attacks before they could reach the hull. The power draw was enormous. The field was, by every reading they had, essentially impenetrable. Except that nothing continuous is truly continuous. Every system breathes. Every field has a rhythm. On day 31, Dami found it. She had not been sleeping properly for a week. She had been eating at the desk. She had been working through models, looking for the pattern in the Varath field data, The small fluctuation that happened at regular intervals, the half-second hiccup in field density that appeared every 43 seconds like a pulse, not a weakness in the traditional sense, a natural exhale in the system. But if you hit that exhale with a harmonic pulse at precisely the right frequency, the standing field did not just weaken. It collapsed entirely, like a soap bubble touched at exactly the wrong point. She ran the model 4 times to make sure she had not made an error. Then she went to the head of the room, laid the printed calculation on his desk and said, "We can break their shields." He looked at the paper for 2 minutes without speaking. She said, "I need production resources." He picked up a phone. Director Haruto Endo received the report 3 days later while reviewing casualty numbers that he had stopped letting himself read as numbers and started forcing himself to read as people. He read Damie's report twice. He called her directly. She explained the principle in 6 minutes. He asked one question: "How many can you build in 30 days?" She said, "7, if I have everything I need." He said, "You'll have everything you need." She said, "Then 7. He said, "That's enough to start." He said it calmly, the way he said most things, and after the call ended he sat in his chair for a minute doing nothing, which was the closest he came these days to acknowledging that the world had changed. Asheri Vin arrived at the campaign's 6th month on a shuttle from the Vareth Senate, not to help, but to observe. The Senate had been receiving Drevon's progress reports and found them satisfying. Earth was being pacified. The timeline was running slightly long, but not unusually so for a multi-continent operation. Ven reviewed the official reports for one day. Then he asked Commander Lyra Vaz for the raw data. She gave it to him without checking with Drevon first, which was a small and deliberate choice on her part. Ven spent 2 days with the raw data. He was a political analyst, not a military officer, but he had served on 7 campaign oversight committees, and he knew what conquest looked like in its numbers: the slow downward curve of resistance activity, the narrowing of human-held territory, the collapse of organized response. That was the pattern. That was what always happened. Earth's numbers did not show that pattern. Human military output had increased by 340% since the campaign began. Not from a high baseline, from almost nothing. They had started with conventional weapons that could not scratch Vareth hull plating, and they were now producing something that his analysts could not fully classify, because it used a working principle that had not existed in any human database before the war. Ven requested a meeting with Drevon. His aide returned with a polite deflection. The admiral was occupied with operational planning and would make time at week's end. Ven looked at the data again. He thought about what it meant that a species being actively bombed had found the time and the minds and the resources to develop novel weapons technology in 6 months. He thought about what it meant that they had not slowed down, that every strike seemed to produce not silence but acceleration. He wrote a short note in his private log, just 4 words. "This is not working." He did not send it to anyone. Not yet. But he kept the raw data files open on his screen for the rest of the night, and he did not sleep well, and in the morning he requested the raw data from the previous 2 weeks as well. He wanted to see the curve more clearly. He was already afraid of what it would show. The signal that went out across 7 ground stations at 300 hours was not a battle cry. It was a timing pulse, a shared clock tick sent simultaneously to 7 teams in 7 locations, each carrying a device that had no official name yet because there had not been time to give it one. The engineers called it the disruptor. The soldiers who carried it called it the answer. Whatever it was, it had never been fired in a real engagement. Haruto Endo sat in the command center and watched the countdown on a monitor. Around him, 14 coalition officers watched too. Nobody spoke. The room had that specific kind of silence that is not quiet at all. It is every person in the space holding their breath in the same direction. The countdown reached 0. 7 disruptors fired at 7 Varath destroyers in low orbit. 4 shield envelopes collapsed. On the monitors, the thermal signatures of those ships changed instantly. The energy field that had made them untouchable simply vanished, and for the first time in the campaign, Varath hull plating was exposed to open fire. 2 of the 4 ships were destroyed in the next 90 seconds by rail-launched surface strikes. The third lost propulsion and began drifting. The fourth managed to regain partial shielding and pulled altitude. The remaining 13 ships in the orbital formation did something that took 3 seconds to register on the monitors. They pulled back. Endo looked at the display for a long moment. He did not cheer. He did not stand up. He looked at the gap in the orbital formation, the space where the Varath fleet had been, now empty, and he pressed his lips together and exhaled through his nose, and then he said, "Get me casualty counts on the surface strikes, and find out if the disruptor teams are intact." Someone shouted something celebratory. He let them have it. They had earned it. On the flagship Undying Reach, Admiral Drevon Solis was standing. He had been standing for 2 hours and he had not noticed because the reports coming in from the surface and from the orbital grid did not make sense. And when things did not make sense, Drevon stood and reread until they did. The problem was that these were not making sense no matter how many times he read them. He had fought 61 campaigns. He knew exactly what primitive species did when they were losing. They collapsed inward. They ran. The braver ones made a last stand somewhere symbolic and died with their flags. That was always the shape of it. The humans had not read the script. He ordered a full tactical reassessment. It was the first time he had issued that order against a pre-spaceflight species. His tactical officers exchanged a look that they thought he didn't see. He saw. Lyra Vaz took the report she had been preparing for 3 weeks directly to Ashari Ven that afternoon. She did not check with Drevon first. She had already decided that if Drevon would not listen, then someone needed to hear it who could act. She laid it on Ven's table and walked him through the numbers. Human weapons development now exceeded the military output of most established civilizations after centuries of dedicated research. Not matching it, exceeding it. The adaptation rate had a name in her personal log now. She had been calling it the runaway capability curve, a system accelerating faster than its inputs should allow, because every setback feeds the next advance rather than depleting the total. Ven listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the final page for a long time. His face was not built for the same expressions as a human face. But Lyra had learned to read the small signals, the shift in his secondary jaw, the way his orbital ridges settled when he was processing something that frightened him. He was frightened. He said, "Does the Admiral have this report?" She said, "He has my previous 3. Ven said, "I will be sending a message to the Senate." She said, "I know." She picked up the report and left. Belanovic's unit moved into the city from the southern approach at dawn, while the sky was still orange and the orbital strike patterns had shifted north. The plan had been worked out over 2 days with 4 other units. A coordinated push the resistance hadn't had the numbers or confidence to attempt before this week. The Varath ground forces in the city were disorganized. The orbital confusion had disrupted their coordination. For the first time, Bella felt the difference between fighting an enemy that was prepared and fighting one that was surprised, and the difference was significant. They moved faster. They took fewer hits. She was crossing a collapsed bridge when the shot caught her in the left shoulder. She went down, got back up in about 3 seconds, finished crossing the bridge, directed her unit to the next objective, and accepted medical attention 40 minutes later when the sector was clear. The medic told her she had a fractured clavicle. She said she had noticed. The medic said she needed to stop moving. She said she would in a while. She didn't stop until the city was retaken. That evening, standing in the rubble of a square she had last seen on a map, she let herself feel it for a moment, not victory exactly. something older and less clean than that. The feeling of a door opening after a very long time of pushing. She knew the war wasn't over, but she could feel it in the way the Varath formations had moved today, not with the lazy confidence of an empire cleaning up a mess, but with the careful caution of something that had been surprised and was not entirely sure what had surprised it. Good, she thought, learn what we are. It's too late, but learn it. 14 months after the first ship appeared over Earth, 11 vessels rose out of the gravity well and headed for the blockade. They were not beautiful. There was nothing elegant about them, no clean Varath lines, no uniform plating, no symmetry. They were assembled from reclaimed materials, repurposed Varath propulsion cores grafted onto human-designed frames, rail platforms bolted to the outside of hulls that had been poured in a hydroelectric plant and cured in 3 weeks instead of 3 months because there was no time for the right way. They were asymmetric, angular, ugly. The engineers who built them knew it. Nobody apologized for it. Adami watched the launch feeds from the facility in Lagos. 11 blips on a screen. She had not slept the night before, not from anxiety, but from work. She was already running calculations for the next generation of disruptors. The fleet going up right now was carrying her first generation, and she had already found 8 ways to improve it. She watched the blips for a while, then she went back to the calculations. The engagement began 4 hours after launch, when the human fleet came within range of the Varath blockade. By every conventional analysis, the engagement should have lasted minutes. The Varath ships were faster, better armored, more precisely manufactured, and had been operating in space for thousands of years. The human ships were first generation, underpowered and crewed by people who had never actually fought in orbit before, only simulated it. The engagement lasted 9 hours and 14 minutes. Of the 11 human vessels, 4 were destroyed, 2 in the first hour, 2 more in a sustained exchange midway through. The other 7 took damage across systems that the crews repaired in real time, making decisions and rerouting power in ways that were not in any manual because no manual had been written. They improvised. They adapted. They communicated between ships in a constant stream, sharing data about what was working and what wasn't, and the ones that received that data changed their approach within seconds. 3 Varath cruisers were destroyed. 2 more were forced to withdraw with critical damage. The Varath rearguard broke formation at hour 8. The human fleet did not retreat. It kept pushing. The blockade fractured. Admiral Drevon Solis gave the order to withdraw at 600 hours. His operations officer asked him to confirm. He confirmed. He wrote in the operational log, strategic repositioning to reassess threat environment. He filed the report and stood with his back to the room for a long time, looking out at the star field. Lyra Vaz was on the bridge. She did not contradict his report in front of the crew. She would never do that to him in front of the crew. But when the room was mostly empty, she walked to where he was standing and said, very quietly, "In recorded Varath history, we have never withdrawn from a species that started the engagement with aircraft made of wood and metal." He said, "I know." She said, "Then you know what the Senate will say when this report arrives." He said, "I know that too." She left him standing there. Ashari Ven's message reached the Senate 16 hours after the battle. It was not a report. It was not the kind of document a political envoy usually sends measured, qualified, professionally cautious. It was 4 pages long, and its tone was something the Senate had not heard from a campaign observer in 400 years. Alarm. He wrote that Earth was no longer a pacification case. He wrote that in 14 months under active bombardment, the human species had developed functional anti-shield technology, rebuilt its command structure, launched an orbital fleet, and engaged Varath cruisers in sustained combat. He wrote that the adaptation rate had no precedent in the Dominion's history. He wrote the phrase "no apparent ceiling" and underlined it, which was not something that appeared in standard Senate documents. He recommended immediate cessation of hostilities. He recommended it without qualification. The Senate debated for 6 days. On Earth, news of the battle spread across whatever networks still functioned. There were celebrations in some places, genuine, exhausted, tearful celebrations. People who had been living underground or in ruins for over a year, finally seeing something that looked like a turning point. In other places, there was no celebration because there were not enough people left to gather, and the ones who were left were too tired and too aware of how many were gone. Haruto Endo received the battle report in the early hours of the morning. He read it fully. He pulled up the casualty numbers for crews. He read those names too. He sat with them for a while. Then he wrote to Dami, second generation, how soon? She replied in 4 minutes, which meant she had not been sleeping either. 6 weeks if materials hold. Already redesigning the frequency modulator. Found a flaw in the first batch. He wrote back, good, fix it. She wrote, already am. What none of them said, not Endo, not Dami, not the crew members who had survived the battle, not the people in the streets, was what they were becoming. It was visible from the outside. It was visible in Lyra Vaz's logs, in Ashari Ven's alarmed report, in the 6 days of Senate debate that should have taken 6 hours if the answer were obvious. Humanity was becoming something the galaxy did not have a word for yet. Not a victim, not a refugee, not a species that had absorbed enough punishment to earn a peace treaty. Something else. Something that hurt the same as other species, but did not behave the same way afterward. The Varath had been winning. They might still believe they were winning. They were not winning. The Varath diplomatic vessel arrived at Earth orbit on a Wednesday morning, broadcasting a white flag frequency on every channel. It was a single ship, small by Varath standards, larger than anything Earth currently had in orbit, and it came alone, which was either a sign of good faith or a sign that they no longer considered a larger escort necessary. Haruto Endo received the request for communication with the same face he brought to every briefing, still, attentive, giving nothing away. He confirmed the channel and put on his jacket and walked to the meeting room, and on the way he passed a window that looked out over a city still half in ruins, cranes working in the morning light, the skeleton of something new going up on the site of something that had been destroyed. He looked at it for a moment, then he went in. Ashari Ven was the one on the other side of the connection. He appeared on screen composed, formal, and visibly older than he had looked in the footage Lyra Vaz had sent 6 months ago. He opened by acknowledging that the Varath Senate had formally suspended campaign operations against Earth, effective immediately, and that his presence here was to begin a formal dialogue. Endo said, I understand. There was a pause. Ven was clearly waiting for something. Anger demands a list of grievances. Endo had seen that expectation coming and had decided, weeks ago, not to give it. He placed a data file on the desk and pushed it toward the camera. He said, this is a complete record of human casualties from the beginning of the campaign to the suspension order, city by city, by name where we have them, where we don't have names by number. We want you to take this file back to the Senate and we want every member of that body to review it, not the summary, the full document. Ven looked at the file. He said, that is not a standard opening for a diplomatic session. Endo said, no, but we want you to understand exactly what was done before we discuss what comes next, because what comes next will be built on that understanding, or it won't hold. Ven was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very well. What came next was not a surrender document and it was not a victory parade. It was a framework built over 3 months of difficult, careful, often stalled negotiation that covered non-aggression guarantees, reparations structured across 30 years, and an open technology exchange that was the part the Varath Senate argued about longest. Not the reparations, the technology exchange. Because it meant acknowledging that humanity had, in 14 months under bombardment, developed things the Dominion hadn't thought to share. That changed the power balance in a way some Senate factions found intolerable. The faction that wanted to resume the war lost the vote, barely, by 4 seats. The signing was not celebrated on Earth the way people expected it to be. There were some events, some speeches, some nights when cities that had power lit up more than they usually did. But mostly what people did was continue the work that had not stopped, rebuilding, burying, counting, trying to find missing people, and usually not finding them, planting things in the ground that would take years to grow. Admiral Drevon Solis was recalled to the Senate Capitol 6 weeks after the withdrawal. He was brought into a chamber and asked to give a full accounting of the campaign, not for the record, but for the military review board that would determine the shape of Vareth doctrine for the next generation. He sat in the chair and answered questions for 2 hours. He was truthful. He had decided, somewhere in the months between the withdrawal and this moment, that the only thing worse than having been wrong was pretending otherwise. At the end, the board chair asked him directly, "What went wrong, in your assessment, from the beginning?" Drevon was quiet for a long time, long enough that someone shifted uncomfortably in the room. Then he said, "We assumed that what had not defeated us yet could not defeat us. We looked at their technology and their history and we made a calculation based on what they were. We did not consider what they might become. We forgot, or we never knew, that there are species which do not break under pressure. They compress. And when enough pressure has been applied for long enough, what comes out the other side is not what went in." He paused. "We hurt them. We hurt them very badly. And they made that hurt into a ladder, and they climbed it while we were still congratulating ourselves on the first strike." Commander Lyra Vaz was in the room. She had transferred to the diplomatic corps 3 months earlier and was present as an observer. She listened and felt something without a clean name, not vindication, because she had not wanted to be right about this. Not satisfaction. More like the exhaustion of watching something you warned about unfold exactly as you feared, knowing the warning was never the same as preventing it. She did not speak during the session. She wrote 1 line in her log on the way out. "He understands now. It cost too much." On Earth, on a street in a city that was rebuilding faster than anyone had projected, Bella Novick knelt in a patch of cleared ground and pressed a small tree into the soil. It was a cherry tree. She did not explain to the people around her why she had chosen that one. She did not make a speech. She packed the soil around the roots and stood up and looked at it for a moment. It would take years to flower. She was fine with that. She understood now the particular value of things that take time.